Hello, this is Jacqueline from Jack Knits again, and welcome to part 2 of our video series on working with Fair Isle knitting. Now, if you haven't watched video 1, feel free to link up above to video 1. You can watch that first, but no need to if you're already a little bit comfortable with Fair Isle knitting. But with that first video, we talked a little bit about the intro to Fair Isle knitting or stranded knitting, what that is about with working with 2 colors of yarn. We talked about reading charts, how to hold your yarn in your hand when you're knitting with 2 colors, and now we're going to discuss in this video how to manage those long floats in the back of your knitting. So let's talk about those floats for a moment. So if you see here in my knitting with 2 colors, when you knit with 2 colors, you're always knitting 1 stitch at a time in 1 color, but the color that you're not using is just kind of chilling back there and traveling along in the back while you're knitting that other color. So in essence, you start getting these long strands of yarn in the back called floats. Now, if these strands get too long, they can catch on your fingers or jewelry when you're wearing a garment, or it can cause a lot of puckering in the fabric if those strands get pulled too tightly. So we want to fix that, and I'm going to show you how to do that in this video by taking those your non-working yarn and tucking it underneath your working yarn as you knit. And we can do that without tangling up our working yarns together. So it's a great way to do it, and it works really well when you're knitting with 1 color in each hand. So if you take a look here at our chart that we're following, I have worked all the way up through row 7 and we're on row 8. And you can see so far up through row 7 we've been pretty lucky, and we've only had 3 stitches at a time with each color. So that's produced about these long of floats, but that's about as long as I'm going to be comfortable with. If they get to be more than 3 stitches and these floats are a little bit longer, I think that's going to look really messy and cause some problems. So I'm going to make it a rule to myself with this pattern that anything longer than 3 stitches, I'm going to catch that non-working yarn under my working yarn. And here's how we're going to do that. We're going to be now working on row 8. I'll have the image up here again. So with row 8, it starts with a gray stitch. So I'm going to knit 1 gray stitch. And now you can see that my pattern calls for 6 stitches in a row that are pink. Now 6 is going to be way too many stitches long for my float, so I'm going to, after I knit 3 pink on my 4th stitch on my needle, I'm going to catch my float. So there's a different way to do it if your working yarn is in your left hand or if your working yarn is in the right hand. I'm going to show you first how to do it with your working yarn in your left hand. It's actually a little bit more difficult than with your right hand, but we'll take care of this first because that's where we are in the pattern with these long pink ones. So let's do our 6 pink stitches, but we're going to stop at stitch 4 and catch that float. So let's knit first 3 pink with our working yarn in our left hand. 1, 2, and 3. Now on this 4th stitch, here's what we're going to do to catch that float. We're going to start to knit that stitch, but before we pick up our yarn in our left hand, we're going to first wrap the yarn counterclockwise with our non-working yarn. So you got that draped over your needle. Now wrap your regular working yarn like you normally would to knit that stitch. But before you knit it, now unwrap the non-working yarn back to the back again. And now you can complete your knit stitch of your working yarn like normal. So now you do not see the pink in front at all, but it magically, you can see on the back here, it magically tucked my gray stitch underneath that pink stitch, so it now caught that float in the back, and I won't have such a long yarn length of yarn in the back when I complete the rest of my pink stitches. So now I've done 4 pink stitches. I need to do 2 more to complete that 6 pink stitches. So let's show you that a couple more times. We're going to now knit in our pattern calls for 1 gray stitch, and now we got to do 6 pink stitches again. So let's again catch that float on that 4th stitch. So let's knit 3 stitches in pink. Now my fourth stitch, we're going to catch that float again. So we're going to start to knit it, wrap your non-working yarn around the needle, wrap your working yarn around the needle, and now unwrap your non-working yarn and finish the knit stitch with your pink yarn. Now I've caught that float. Finish with my 2 pink knit stitches, and now we're at the end of that 14 stitch sequence. Slip my marker and we'll repeat it. Let's show it to you one more time. It's going to be a little tricky. Knit that first gray stitch. Now let's do our catching float on that 4th pink stitch again. 1, 2, 3, and here's the one we're going to catch. Knit, wrap, wrap, unwrap, complete your knit stitch. And 2 more. One more time for good measure. Gray stitch, 1 pink, 2 pink, 3 pink. Let's wrap it again, catch it again. Knit, wrap, wrap, unwrap, and complete the knit. And finish those 2 additional pink stitches. So that's how you do it when you have a long series of stitches with your left hand, your popping color pink. Now I will knit for a few more rows because eventually we're going to have that same problem where we have, here in this case, 5 stitches of gray yarn in a row. So we're going to want to catch the float with our pink stitch with our working yarn in our right hand. So that's just a little bit different. It's actually a little bit easier. So let me get up to that row 12 and we'll show you how to do that. Alright, I've knitted a few more rounds and now I'm at the point where I need to catch the float because I'm working too many stitches in a row with the yarn in my right hand. So you'll see here on row 12, I'm running into that similar situation, but now with a gray yarn where I've got 5 stitches in a row with a gray yarn. So I'm going to want to catch my float on this middle stitch, this 3rd stitch, but now I'm going to want to do a little different method. It's actually a little easier than what we just reviewed the other way. So again, working on row 12. Row 12 starts with 2 pink stitches, so I will knit those 2 pink stitches with my left hand. And now we have 1 gray stitch, 2 pink stitches, and now we've got that series of 5 stitches in a row with gray. So on that 3rd stitch, we're going to catch our float. So now we're working with our yarn in our right hand. So we're going to knit 1, 2, and now on this 3rd one, let's catch. And this one's a little bit easier. What we're going to do is insert our needle like we're going to knit that stitch, but we're just going to now kind of put our needle as we're slipping it through under that non-working yarn over here. Just slide it under that yarn. Now we're going to wrap our working yarn around the needle and knit the stitch and pull it off. So that, in a sense, caught that pink yarn underneath the gray yarn, so that pink yarn is caught. Now we can continue knitting the rest of our gray stitches. Oops, gray, not pink. Gray stitches, 2 more. So now we've got our 5 stitches in a row, but that float was caught behind there. All right, now let's continue with that row, and then I'll show the sequence, and I'll show you that one more time. So we got 2 knit stitches. And yeah, so now we're ready again for 5 stitches of our gray. So let's knit 2 gray stitches. And on that 3rd stitch again, we're going to catch that float. So again, insert our needle as if to knit, but slide it under that working needle. Wrap the gray yarn or your working yarn around the needle and knit it. And that catches that pink yarn underneath there. Great, now we can continue with our 2 gray stitches again and finish that sequence. So that one is actually a little bit easier. It's just kind of one motion, whereas the other one requires a couple different motions, but both very easy to do and a great way to make that back side of your knitting much more even and nicely. So you can see here these little bits where I've caught those floats behind my stitches, and it just creates a much even sequence of stitching. So you may be wondering, well, how far, when do you need to make that rule? Like, how many stitches do you need to do before you catch a float? Well, that really depends from pattern to pattern. You know, on this particular one, I decided that no more than 3 stitches before I caught the float because I didn't want anything longer than that. Now, if you're working with much finer yarn, you might be able to get away with knitting more stitches because the distance of those stitches are not as long. So you might be able to get by with working at least 5 stitches in a row before you need to float. If the yarn is thicker, you might only need to knit 2 stitches before you need to catch a float. So it really depends on the pattern or what your own preference is, how much you're willing to tolerate in the back with those long floats. So I hope you found this helpful. If so, I would encourage you to move on to the 3rd video where we're going to talk about how to fix this jog in your knitting when you're knitting Fair Isle knitting in the round. When you get to the end of the round, your pattern tends to shift a little bit, as you see here. So we're going to learn a fun little trick on how to fix that in the next video. Link up above or at the end of this video, so stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching, everyone. Happy knitting.